the heart of the Franciscan tradition is a simple but nonetheless radical truth that love and the bonds of unity which it brings is the single most precious thing in this life. St Francis of Assisi taught us that all creation is covered with the fingerprints of God's love. It is this conviction which lay at the heart of his belief that each person, irrespective of their gender, their race, culture, or background, is a window into God's inner life. Crucially, what St. Francis also realized is that it is the poor and the marginalized, those whom our society often forgets, who are the true apple of God's eye. These are the people whom the Church must continually seek out and strive to be a voice for. What all this tells us is that St. Francis recognized an important truth, one which subsequent Franciscan theologians have tried to underscore time and time again. Love is not simply a feeling or something which exists exclusively within our hearts. Rather, love is, at its deepest level, an act. It is something which we do. Love is quite simply our humanity in motion. As such, for St. Francis, if we are to love properly, it is not enough just to love with our hearts or even our souls. We must instead love with our hands. Our love, to put it another way, must be a love which seeks to build a better world, one in which all peoples have enough to live with dignity and achieve their hopes and dreams. Crucially, St. Francis realized that if love is to be practical, then it must be accompanied by two indispensable virtues: compassion and profound humility. These are, for want of a better phrase, love's children. And love cannot exist or function properly without them. On compassion, St. Francis taught his friars that they should offer their love and forgiveness freely to all, asking for nothing in return and turning no one aside. On humility, he taught his friars that they should never seek to be the center of attention or to occupy the spotlight. Rather, they should carry out their ministry quietly and in a spirit of unassuming simplicity. St. Francis once famously said, "Preach the gospel, use words if you have to." His reason for doing so is that he recognized a fundamental truth, that acts of love, clothed in humility and mercy, speak louder, more convincingly, and far more profoundly than do erudite sermons or complex theological diatribes. In the days that have followed Pope Francis's death, much has been made, and rightly so, of the very many similarities between Pope Francis and his name's sake. When we reflect on Pope Francis's papacy, and indeed his ministry, both as a priest and then as a bishop and an archbishop, we see that, even though he himself was not a Franciscan, There runs throughout all that he said and did a profoundly Franciscan spirit. Like St Francis, Pope Francis recognized love's primacy over all things, and the need for love always to be accompanied by compassion and humility. In turn, Pope Francis understood, just as St Francis himself had, that the natural world, in all its richness and complexity, is covered with the fingerprints of the triune God, and must as such be valued as both holy and worthy of love. And finally, like St. Francis, Pope Francis recognized that each person, regardless of how broken or marginalized or forgotten they may be, is a point of encounter with the living God, and thus a sacramental moment in which his eternity meets our time. There are many people today asking, what is Pope Francis's legacy? The answer, I think, can be summarized in a single sentence. He taught the Church how to smile again. Like the poor man of Assisi, he realized that the Church is called to live joyfully, but that if it is to fulfill this vocation, and thus be the abiding and prophetic sacrament of God's life-giving love for all, then it must go out into the world and seek out the poor, the needy, the downtrodden, and the vulnerable, and tell them that they are not forgotten. Crucially, it must speak to them not just with kind words and warm wishes, but with concrete and life-changing actions. That is to say, it must help lift them out of their marginalized state, and thus facilitate the creation of a fairer and more just world. In short, Pope Francis, like St Francis of Assisi, called the Church to a life of practical love. In recent days, much has been made of the fact that Pope Francis died only a few hours after Easter Sunday, the day when we as Christians believe that Jesus Christ, the poor and humble carpenter of Nazareth, rose from the dead. In one of his Easter sermons, St. Bonaventure observed that what called Christ from the tomb was the very same thing which led him to the cross and fixed him there: the infinite and inescapable gravity of love. Over this Easter octave, the Church has seen daily, in an unmistakable and humbling way, how love is that which threads life and death together, and how, in turn, it is love which calls life out of death and leads it to its eternal home. For both Pope Francis and St. Francis, the Easter message is one in which love, clothed with mercy and humility, vanquishes death and reveals its identity as the origin, meaning, and final end of this life. Both St. Francis and Pope Francis taught us that the Easter message is simply this: all things were made by love. All things show forth love, and all things shall return to love.